For 11 standard years, a station with no government held the richest crossing in known space. No fleet defended it, no law governed it, no throne sat at its center. It had no capital, no charter recognized by any power, no name on any official star map except the one its own people scratched into the hull. And yet for 11 years, every convoy that wanted to cross the Tellurian Gap, the only stable jump corridor between three of the wealthiest trade spheres in the quadrant, had to pass beneath its guns, pay its tolls, and accept its terms. Not the conquered, the great ordered power that everyone remembers, not the Drennan Combine, not the Selvani Admiralty, not any of the institutions whose names fill the official histories. The thing that ruled the gap was a derelict transit waypoint that the humans called Nassau Reach. A wreck, a scrap heap with a docking ring, a station the conquered itself had abandoned as worthless. I am Veth Sauron, archivist of the Conquered Records Authority, and I have spent 40 years writing the official account of those 11 years. I will tell you plainly what my own institution preferred to forget. The most lawless republic in the history of the Gap was not founded by warlords or conquerors. It was founded by people we had already beaten, people with nothing left to lose and no king to tell them what to do with it. So how did a stranded salvage crew turn a dead station into a power that defied the conquered for over a decade? And how did one ruined waypoint, governed by nothing but the loudest argument in the room, hold a corridor that 3 empires wanted? To understand that, we have to start with the map. Picture the Tellurian Gap. On one side, the inner trade sphere, dense, rich, hungry for raw material. On another, the outer mining colonies, choking on ore they cannot move fast enough. And between them, a third sphere of manufacturing worlds that turn one into the other. 3 economies, each desperate for what the others hold. And between all 3, a single narrow band of stable space where a ship can cross safely without being torn apart by the unstable currents that surround it. That band is the Tellurian Gap. Everything that moves between the spheres moves through it. Ore freighters loaded to their structural limits, passenger liners, component haulers carrying half-finished machines worth more than a colony's annual yield. Every leg of that traffic is money, staggering, region-shaping money. And every leg of it is vulnerable, because the gap is too far from any capital for a navy to patrol it properly. And the freighters that cross it are slow, lightly armed, and crewed by workers who are paid almost nothing to risk everything. In the middle of that corridor, at the exact point where every route converged, the conquered had once built a transit waypoint. A refueling station, a customs post, a place to stop and breathe. And then decades before this story begins, the conquered decided it was too expensive to maintain so far from home, and it pulled the staff, cut the power, and left the station to drift. A dead ring of metal at the center of the busiest crossing in the quadrant. That dead station was about to become the humans' hunting ground, but the first humans who reached it were not hunters, they were the hunted. The salvage crew of the Margaret Vane did not come to the Gap to build a republic. They came because they had been robbed. According to the surviving logs, and I have read all of them, the Margaret Vane was an independent human salvage vessel under a captain named Mara Devlin. Her crew were not soldiers. They were scrappers, the people who cut apart dead ships and dead stations for metal, the lowest and least romantic profession in the Gap. They had spent 2 years filling their holds with reclaimed alloy, and they were hauling it inward to sell when a conquered patrol stopped them under a licensing statute that, I will admit, was written specifically to let us seize cargo from independents who could not afford the paperwork. The patrol took everything. 2 years of work, gone in an afternoon, perfectly legally. They left the Margaret Vane her engines and just enough fuel to limp somewhere and die quietly. They did not leave her enough to reach a port. Devlin was 41 years old. She had spent more than half her life in the dark, doing the work nobody wanted, watching licensed operators with the right stamps take the profit from people like her. She was tired, she was furious, and she was, by every reasonable measure, finished. The nearest fuel was the dead waypoint at the center of the gap, and the dead waypoint had nothing, no power, no air, no help. She went there anyway because there was nowhere else. What she found was not nothing. The station was a hulk, but a hulk is a salvager's natural habitat. The reactor was dead but intact. The docking ring was cracked but holdable, and the structure, built by the conquered to last centuries, was still sound. Devlin's crew did the only thing they knew how to do. They took the dead station apart with their hands and their tools, and they put just enough of it back together to keep themselves alive. Then other ships started arriving. This is the part the official record never explains well, because the official record cannot admit how many people the conquered had quietly ruined. There were a great many crews like the Margaret Vane, independents, salvagers, freelance haulers, people stripped of cargo or license or hope and left drifting at the edges of legal space. Word travels in the dark. Within a season, the dead waypoint had a dozen wrecked crews squatting in it, fighting over the same scraps, and on the edge of turning on each other. Devlin made a different proposal. According to the testimony given much later at the Concord Tribunal, she stood in the half-pressurized hub of the station and told the others, more or less, that they could keep starving as free people, or they could starve together fighting over garbage, but that there was a third option nobody had tried. They could make the station pay for itself. The convoys had to pass right outside the door. The conquered wouldn't protect them out here. So why not become the thing the convoys had to deal with? She is recorded as saying something close to this, that she had been robbed by people with the right paperwork her whole life, and that if the choice was between being nobody's free woman or somebody's licensed servant, she would be free or she would be nothing. The crews voted. It was the first vote and it would not be the last. They chose to stay. They chose to make the Reach a port. And within 2 years, that decision would humiliate the most powerful institution in the quadrant. The first ship the Reach ever stopped was not robbed. That detail matters more than anything else in this story. A licensed Concord component hauler, the Tessiter, came through the corridor expecting the same empty waypoint that had been there for decades. Instead, it found a station with lights, with a working docking ring, and with 2 salvage tugs sitting across the approach lane in a way that made it very clear the Tessiter was not going to simply pass. The humans did not open fire. They hailed the hauler and informed its captain that Nassau Reach was now a functioning port, that the corridor it sat in was now subject to a docking toll, and that the toll was a modest percentage of cargo value, payable on the way through. They did not demand the cargo. They did not demand the ship. They asked for a cut, and they made it cheaper to pay than to fight or to turn back. The Tessiter's captain, after a long and very nervous silence, paid, and then the humans did the thing that made the Reach what it became. They let him go. Cargo intact, crew unharmed, ship undamaged, free to continue inward and deliver his load and report exactly what had happened. This was the pattern that would define Nassau Reach for the next decade, and it is worth stating plainly because it is the opposite of how every outlaw before them had operated. They were bold but never greedy. They were ruthless about the toll but generous with everything else. They understood, and I do not know how a crew of scrappers understood this when entire navies did not, that a port everyone fears is destroyed quickly, but a port everyone can survive becomes permanent. If you let your prey live and prosper, your prey comes back, and it tells others it is safe to come back. The Tessiter's report should have brought a war fleet. Instead, it brought more ships. Within a year, convoy captains were routing through the Reach on purpose, because a known toll is better than an unknown risk, and because the corridor outside the Reach had quietly become the safest stretch of the gap. The humans, having nothing, had discovered the one thing the Concord's licensed pirates had never offered anyone: predictability. You knew exactly what the Reach would take, and you knew exactly what it would leave you. In a region built on legal theft, that honesty was worth a fortune. The Reach grew rich, not on plunder, on reliability, and the institution that had abandoned the station as worthless began, slowly, to notice that its abandoned scrap heap was now skimming a percentage off the most valuable corridor in the quadrant. But the toll was never the interesting part. The interesting part was how the humans governed the thing they had built, and that is where the real story of Nassau Reach lives. There was no captain of Nassau Reach. This is the detail that my colleagues at the Records Authority found genuinely impossible to believe, and I understand why. Every power we know is a hierarchy. The conquered is a hierarchy. The Selvani Admiralty I was born into is a hierarchy so old we have a word for the feeling of obeying it. We assumed for years that there had to be a hidden king at the center of the Reach, a warlord pulling strings, a secret commander issuing orders. Our intelligence reports kept searching for him. There was no him. There was the assembly. Every dockhand, every salvager, every cook and engineer and freelance hauler who put in time at the Reach got a voice and got a vote. And they used both constantly, and they used both loudly, on absolutely everything. The Concord's listening posts recorded years of these proceedings, and I have reviewed them, and I must tell you that a great deal of the most lawless republic in known space consisted of human beings arguing for hours about matters of no consequence whatsoever. They voted on the docking fee, which was reasonable. They also voted on what color to paint the docking ring, which took, according to the transcript, 3 full sessions and a recount. They voted on whether the station should have a mascot, and then on which mascot, and the official record of the Tellurian Gap's most feared port includes a heated 40-minute debate over whether a small 6-legged vermin species that infested the lower decks should be adopted as a symbol of the Reach's resilience or exterminated as a health hazard. The vermin won. They named it. I will not record the name, as it is obscene in 2 languages. They voted on soup. There is a session, preserved in full, in which the entire assembly of Nassau Reach, the people who controlled the richest crossing in the quadrant, debated for the better part of a shift whether the communal galley's standard ration soup was, and I am quoting the human term, an insult to the concept of food. The motion to change the recipe passed. The recipe was changed. The matter was considered by them exactly as important as the docking statute. We laughed at this in the early reports. We thought it proved they were not serious. We were wrong, and it took us years to understand why. The endless voting was not a weakness. It was the entire machine. A people who vote on the soup are a people who believe the soup is theirs, and a people who believe everything is theirs will defend all of it, because there is no king whose problem it is instead. Every dockhand who had argued about the paint felt that the Reach belonged to him, because, in a literal sense, it did. And underneath the noise, they had built something none of us expected. Early on, the assembly had written down what it had agreed to, a plain document the humans called the Reach Charter. It guaranteed every working hand a share of the toll and a vote in the assembly. It set out how disputes were settled, how newcomers were admitted, how the toll was spent. It forbade any one crew from claiming the station, forbade selling a fellow worker's share out from under them, forbade the very kind of paperwork robbery that had created most of them in the first place. It was crude. It was argued over endlessly and amended constantly. And it was, though none of us would say so for a long time, the first interstellar code of government by consent that anyone in the Gap had ever written down. Their ships were held together with mismatched parts and stubbornness. No 2 airlocks on the station opened the same way. Their defensive guns were salvaged from a dozen different navies and could barely be aimed by the same crew. By every standard of Selvani engineering, Nassau Reach should not have functioned for a single day. And yet it functioned for 11 years, because the thing holding it together was never the machinery. It was the agreement. The humans had discovered that reputation defended them better than firepower ever could, that a convoy captain who trusted the Reach would never need to be fought, and so they spent more effort keeping their word than maintaining their guns. It worked. For a long time, it worked beautifully. By the 8th year, the worthless scrap heap was the single most profitable point of trade in the Tellurian Gap, and the conquered could no longer pretend not to notice. By the 8th year, The humiliation had become unbearable for my institution. The numbers were impossible to hide. A station the conquered had abandoned as worthless was now taking a steady cut of nearly all corridor traffic. And worse, far worse, in the eyes of the Admiralty, convoys were beginning to prefer it. Licensed Concord captains were filing routes through Nassau Reach not because they were forced to, but because it was safer, faster, and more honest than the official channels. The shareholders of the great trade combines, who answer to no one's sense of dignity, began demanding to know why their cargo was paying a toll to a crew of stateless scrappers, and why the conquered Navy could not simply remove them. The Navy had tried. This is the part my colleagues find most embarrassing, so I will state it carefully. We had sent ships. Twice. The first time, a conquered cutter arrived to issue a seizure order and found that the humans had quietly mined the only stable approach lane with salvage charges, and that the Reach's mismatched guns, however laughable individually, were many. The cutter withdrew to await reinforcement, and by the time reinforcement could be organized, the corridor's instability had shifted and the window had closed. The second attempt fared worse, and the Reach commemorated it by painting the captured hull of a conquered gunship across the front of their docking ring, where every passing convoy could see it. They were, by then, openly insulting us. Something had to change. And the thing that changed was that the Admiralty finally stopped sending people who wanted to charge the station and sent someone who wanted to understand it. His name was Coran Ald. He held the rank of Fleet Master, and he was, in every way, the opposite of the humans he was sent to destroy. Where the Reach was loud, Ald was silent. Where the Reach improvised, Ald planned. He was Selvani, like me, and he carried the patience of our species the way other commanders carry a weapon. He did not request a war fleet. He requested time, and the corridor's traffic logs, and the years of assembly recordings that our listening posts had gathered, and that everyone before him had dismissed as noise. Al did not dismiss the noise. He studied it, and in studying it, he understood what no admiral before him had grasped, that you could not catch Nassau Reach in a fight, because the Reach would never give you a fight it could lose. The humans were too quick to mine an approach, too willing to let prey go rather than provoke a war, too disciplined about their reputation to ever overextend. You could not beat them by being stronger. You had to beat them by knowing them better than they knew themselves. You had to find the one moment when the station could neither run nor fight, and be there waiting for it. So Coran Ald waited, and he read, and he learned the rhythms of the Reach the way a hunter learns the trails of a thing that does not know it is being hunted. And the humans, at the height of their power, were beginning to make the small mistakes that comfort always brings. They had grown rich. The assembly, once sharp, had grown slow and quarrelsome, spending more time on the soup and the mascot than on the question of who might be listening. The minds on the approach lane were old and some had drifted, and they had grown so used to winning that they had stopped believing they could lose. Ald saw all of it. He was simply waiting for the one window he knew was coming. The window was the reactor. Even Nassau Reach could not escape the most basic law of every station ever built, that the thing keeping you alive must, eventually, be shut down and serviced, or it will kill you. The Reach's reactor, salvaged and patched and overworked for 11 years, required a full refit. While it was offline, the station would run on stored reserves. The guns would be at minimum power. The defensive systems would be dark. For roughly 30 hours, the most feared port in the gap would be a cold ring of metal in the dark, unable to fight and unable to run. The humans knew this was dangerous. The assembly debated it, and the recordings show real fear in the argument, and a serious proposal to post the salvage tugs as pickets during the refit. But the refit had been delayed twice already, the reactor was failing, and in the end they voted to risk it quickly, during what they believed was a quiet stretch of corridor traffic. They were wrong about the quiet. Coran Ald had been waiting 8 months for exactly this, and he knew the refit schedule, because the humans had argued about it on an open channel for 3 sessions, and his listening posts had recorded every word. What Al did next was the maneuver that ended the Republic, and I record it with no pride. He did not approach with a war fleet. He approached with one ship, his own flagship, disguised down to its transponder as a crippled component hauler limping through the corridor and broadcasting a distress signal. A wounded merchant, alone, slow, helpless. Exactly the kind of ship the Reach had let pass and protected 1,000 times. The Reach, true to 11 years of habit, sent out its salvage tugs to render aid. It was the most human thing they ever did, and it killed them. The tugs were the only mobile defense the station had during the refit, and Al had drawn them out into the open, away from the cold guns, the way you lure a guard from a door. When his concealed weapons opened on them at close range, 2 of the 3 tugs were destroyed before their crews understood what they were looking at. The third broke and ran for the station, screaming a warning into a port that could not power its guns to answer. The hidden Conquered squadron Ald had positioned beyond sensor range, then closed on the dark and silent Reach. There was almost no battle. There could not be. A station running on reserves cannot trade fire with a fleet. What there was, instead, was a last stand at the station's heart, in the half-pressurized hub where Mara Devlin had once asked a room of ruined people to be free or to be nothing. Devlin was 62 years old by then. She had been offered terms. The records of the assault confirmed that Corin Ald, who was not a cruel commander, transmitted an offer: surrender the station, surrender the charter as a renunciation of any claim, and the people of the Reach would be spared the worst of the sentencing. Devlin's answer survives because it was broadcast on the open channel for the whole corridor to hear. She said the station was scrap and they could have the scrap. But the charter was not hers to surrender. It belonged to everyone who had ever voted under it, including the ones not yet born, and she could not give away a thing that was not hers alone. Then she stopped transmitting. She did not survive the boarding. The details are disputed, and I will not pretend to certainty about a woman's last minutes from the reports of the people who killed her. What is certain is that Nassau Reach fell, that the lights went out for the last time, and that the most lawless republic in known space ended not in a great battle, but in a cold, dark, silent room, defended by people who had agreed they would rather lose everything than be governed by anyone but themselves. The conquered declared a complete victory, and then the conquered discovered that it had won the worst possible thing. The station was taken. Devlin was dead. Of the people of the Reach, many scattered into the dark before the boarding, slipping away in salvage craft to disappear among the independent worlds. The ones who were captured, somewhat over 200 of them, were tried before a conquered tribunal, the largest such proceeding in the history of the Gap. Some were imprisoned. Some were sentenced to labor in the very mining colonies whose ore had crossed beneath their guns. The Reach Charter was entered into the record as evidence of sedition, read aloud in full so that its criminality could be established. I was present at that reading. I remember the silence in the chamber afterward, and I remember that no one quite wanted to be the first to speak. Because here is what the conquered learned in the year that followed, and here is the irony I have spent 40 years failing to write my way around. We took the corridor, and we could not hold it. We had destroyed the only thing that made the Gap function, not the station, but the agreement. The convoys had crossed safely for 11 years because they trusted the Reach's word. With the Reach gone, the trust went with it. The corridor descended into exactly the chaos the humans had once ended. Unlicensed raiders, real ones this time, with none of Devlin's restraint, moved into the vacuum. Convoy losses in the Gap in the 2 years after the fall of Nassau Reach exceeded the total losses of the entire 11 years the Reach had ruled. We had removed the toll keeper and inherited the storm. The trade combines, who do not care about dignity but care very much about cargo, demanded a solution. And the solution the conquered's own administrators arrived at, after long study of why the corridor had ever worked, was to establish a permanent licensed free port at the center of the Gap. A port with a published, predictable toll, a guaranteed safe passage, a guarantee that cargo would be left untouched, and a local assembly of corridor workers with a formal voice in how the port was run. They wrote a statute for it. I have read the statute and I have read the charter, and I will tell you what almost no one in my institution will say aloud. They are, in their essential provisions, the same document. The Concord Freeport Statute that governs the Tellurian Gap to this day, the proud, official, legal foundation of corridor trade, is, clause for clause, the thing a stranded salvage captain dictated in a half-pressurized hub because she had been robbed one too many times. We read her charter into the record as a crime. Then we adopted it as law and put our own seal on the top. That is the whole of it. We erased the place and enshrined the idea. We hanged the principle and then ruled by it. The most successful experiment in self-government the Gap has ever seen was carried out by people we classified as stateless criminals, and the only reason corridor trade functions today is that we were eventually forced to govern exactly as they did by consent, by predictability, by keeping our word. They proved it could be done. We took the proof and removed their names from it. Nothing of the station survives. The hulk was stripped and the ring was cut up for scrap, which Mara Devlin, who began her life as a scrapper, might have found fitting. There is no monument. The official histories give the 11 years of the Reach a few cautious paragraphs and the word interregnum, which is a long word that means we would prefer not to discuss it. The name Nassau Reach appears on no current star map. The painted hull of the gunship they captured and mocked us with was melted down for the metal. And yet the corridor crosses safely, and every convoy that pays its predictable toll and continues on unharmed is living, without knowing it, inside the argument those people had about the soup. The thing they built outlived the fleet that broke it. The charter outlived the woman who refused to surrender it. The idea that free people, with no king and no fear and an unreasonable willingness to vote on absolutely everything, could govern themselves better than an empire could govern them, outlived every ship on both sides of the day it was supposedly destroyed. I am Veth Sauron, and this is the record I was assigned to write. I have written it as honestly as my position allows, which is to say more honestly than my position prefers. The conquered one at Nassau Reach. I was raised to believe that winning is the thing that lasts, but I have spent 40 years watching a dead woman's argument become the law I serve under, and I have come, in my old age, to a conclusion I am not permitted to publish. You can take the station. You can scatter the people and burn the charter and melt the mocking hull and strike the name from every map in the quadrant. You can win every battle there is to win. You cannot unprove a thing once it has been proven. And on a dead waypoint at the center of the gap, for 11 loud and lawless and gloriously ungoverned years, a crew of ruined people proved it.